In 2014, her face was inescapable. It graced the covers of Forbes and Fortune, dominated award ceremonies, and stood alongside the world's most powerful figures. The black turtleneck, the meticulous blonde hair, the piercing, unblinking stare, and the voice, a startlingly deep baritone that commanded attention, sounding like a person far older and more established. She was Elizabeth Holmes, hailed as the next Steve Jobs, and at just 30 years old, she was the youngest self-made female billionaire in the United States. Her company, Theranos, was valued at a staggering $9 billion, all built upon one simple, revolutionary claim: blood analysis from a single drop. She promised to liberate the world from large, intimidating needles and multiple vials. She vowed to make diagnostics cheap, fast, and accessible to everyone. From a mere finger prick to a comprehensive overview of your health, this technology was poised to rewrite the future of medicine. She garnered the backing of former secretaries of state, decorated generals, and influential media moguls. She was the very embodiment of the Silicon Valley dream, a visionary who wasn't just faking it till she made it, but one who was genuinely saving lives. And then, in a terrifyingly swift and public fall, it all dissolved. Overnight, her net worth was revised to nothing. The object of universal admiration became a convicted felon. The story of Elizabeth Holmes is not merely the chronicle of a failed startup. It is a meticulous, sprawling narrative of how a masterfully crafted illusion first convinced the creator herself and then enveloped the entire world, including some of the sharpest minds in finance and politics. To truly understand the audacity and scale of this deception, we must begin at the root. Elizabeth Ann Holmes was born in 1984 in Washington, D.C., into a family that possessed a palpable obsession with regaining a sense of lost prestige. Her father, Christian Holmes, was a former vice president at Enron, a company whose spectacular collapse would later serve as a grim, if unintentional, prelude to his daughter's own scandal. The family also held a deep pride in their ancestral ties to Charles Louis Fleischmann, the founder of the venerable American yeast empire. This history, according to those who knew her, deeply embedded in young Elizabeth a fierce and unrelenting drive to restore a bygone financial and social eminence. From an early age, she exhibited extraordinary, almost monomaniacal, ambition. In high school, she was already engaged in early entrepreneurship, attempting to sell C++ compilers to universities in China. She was focused, highly motivated, and seemed instinctively to grasp the value of image and confidence. In 2002, she enrolled at Stanford University to study chemical engineering, but her academic path was quickly diverted by a singular obsession. The impetus for her multi-billion-dollar enterprise was a common, almost mundane phobia, a fear of needles. Following a summer stint at a laboratory in Singapore, where she worked on SARS testing and observed the cumbersome process of drawing blood with syringes, Holmes conceived of a revolutionary idea. Initially, it was a wearable patch that could monitor blood, perform diagnostics, and even regulate drug delivery. By 2003, this had evolved into the concept of a lab on a chip, a device capable of running a massive menu of tests using only a few drops of blood collected from a simple finger prick. The promise was to slash costs, eliminate invasive procedures, and bring healthcare directly to the consumer. She pitched this audacious concept to Stanford medical professors, most notably Phyllis Gardner, who was immediately skeptical. Gardner firmly dismissed the idea, stating, "I don't think your idea is going to work," explaining the scientific impossibility of gaining meaningful data from such a minute volume of blood. But Elizabeth Holmes had a selective ear. She only absorbed validation. She found her necessary enabler in her advisor, the engineering professor Channing Robertson, who, despite lacking medical expertise, was captivated by her vision. In March 2004, having completed only her freshman year, Elizabeth Holmes made the pivotal decision that launched her legend. She dropped out of Stanford. The tuition money intended for her education became the seed funding for her company. Initially named Real-Time Cures, she soon realized the word cure generated too much skepticism. It was then rebranded as Theranos, a clinical-sounding portmanteau of therapy and diagnosis, a name that instantly sounded both legitimate and futuristic. It was during this formative period that the second central figure entered the spotlight, Ramesh Sunny Balwani. A Pakistani-born technology entrepreneur 19 years her senior, Holmes had met him during that Mandarin program in Beijing in 2002. He was married at the time. Soon after her Stanford dropout, their professional relationship morphed into a secret, romantic one, and they moved in together in 2005. Though Balwani did not officially assume the title of president and chief operating officer until 2009, he was her closest confidant and advisor from the start, injecting millions of his own capital into the struggling venture. He became the dark matter of Theranos, the force that helped shape the culture of fear and secrecy that defined the company. At the very beginning, they were a private, highly guarded partnership, operating in stealth mode, shielding their work from outside scrutiny. In the early years, Theranos quietly amassed over $92 million in venture capital. By 2011, Holmes achieved her first major PR coup, recruiting former Secretary of State George Shultz to her board. Shultz, thoroughly enchanted by her charisma, served as the gateway, pulling in a constellation of other heavy hitters from the worlds of diplomacy, military, and corporate America. By 2013, when Theranos finally emerged from the shadows, it was no longer a nascent startup. It was a flawlessly polished narrative. Holmes had secured a high-profile partnership with Walgreens, promising to roll out her blood testing centers across their national pharmacy chain. The press lauded her as a transformative figure. The world believed in the genius who had supposedly solved a problem the medical establishment had deemed impossible. The stark truth, however, was that everything the world celebrated was an elaborate, costly, and dangerous fabrication. The underlying technology did not work. The results were worthless. The illusion was set in place. Now, the only remaining question was how long two people, working in total secrecy, could maintain the perfect lie. The world saw Elizabeth Holmes, the genius. What the world did not see was the daily reality behind the heavily guarded doors of the Theranos headquarters in Palo Alto. In the place where a medical revolution was supposedly being born, a totalitarian corporate culture reigned, enforced by Holmes and her clandestine partner, Sunny Balwani. The atmosphere was described by employees as suffocating, a bizarre hybrid of a secretive tech startup and a paranoid military operation. The key to the cover-up was the implementation of a need-to-know policy so extreme that it became a foundational lie. Engineers were forbidden from speaking to chemists. Chemists could not consult with lab technicians. No one, apart from Holmes and Balwani, was allowed to see the full, terrifying picture. Any employee who dared to voice a doubt about the technology's viability or the accuracy of the results was immediately marginalized, threatened with legal action, or summarily fired. Former staff recalled Balwani as an unhinged tyrant who enforced his rule through abusive shouting, public humiliations, and intimidation. Holmes, meanwhile, maintained her stoic, turtlenecked facade, exhibiting a serene, cult-like conviction that permitted zero dissent. She ensured every employee was bound by draconian non-disclosure agreements, fortifying the company with a legal iron curtain. The central failure, and the core of the fraud, was the machine she affectionately named Edison, a nod to the inventor Thomas Edison, who famously found 10,000 ways that wouldn't work. The name would prove to be a chilling premonition. The Edison, designed to be compact and automated, was supposed to run hundreds of tests from their proprietary nanotainer, which held only a few drops of blood from a finger prick. The scientific hurdle remained insurmountable. The volume was insufficient for most validated assays, and the minuscule blood samples often clotted or degraded before analysis could be completed. The results from the Edison were wildly inconsistent, frequently illogical, and ultimately useless for medical diagnosis. Faced with this existential technical failure, the partners chose fraud over capitulation. They began a methodical process of simulation. For the vast majority of the patient tests Theranos offered, they simply bypassed the Edison. Instead, they acquired and utilized standard, large-scale commercial lab equipment manufactured by rivals like Siemens. This equipment required traditional venipuncture, a full vial of blood from the arm, not a finger prick. To maintain the illusion of their minimalist technology, Theranos technicians were instructed to illegally hack these third-party machines, forcing them to run the tiny nanotainer samples. This frequently required diluting the blood, an act that catastrophically skewed the results, generating data that was not just inaccurate, but medically dangerous. To lend this elaborate charade an aura of untouchable legitimacy, Holmes constructed her famous Board of Counselors, a dazzling array of the American elite. The roster included former Secretaries of State Henry Kissinger and George Shultz, former Secretary of Defense William Perry, and future Secretary of Defense James Mattis, alongside powerful CEOs. Crucially, none of these illustrious figures possessed any significant expertise in clinical pathology, biochemistry, or laboratory testing. Their authority, their military and political connections, were used as an impregnable shield to repel the scrutiny of genuine medical experts and regulatory bodies. The wealth of investors who poured hundreds of millions into Theranos, including the Waltons, Rupert Murdoch, and Betsy DeVos, were largely seduced by this glittering, medically illiterate board and Holmes's powerful, unwavering conviction. Fortified by this board, Holmes moved from experimental lab to the public square, sealing a deal first with Safeway, a $350 million pact that luckily collapsed before full implementation, and then with Walgreens. This was the critical pivot point where corporate misrepresentation crossed the line into widespread public harm. Starting in 2013, Theranos Wellness Centers began opening in Walgreens locations, offering quick, affordable tests based on the finger prick. The consequences were immediate and catastrophic. Patients began receiving bizarre, conflicting, and medically alarming results. False positives for HIV, erroneous cancer markers, and perhaps most perilously, critically inaccurate readings for blood thinners like warfarin, which could lead directly to a fatal clot or hemorrhage. Theranos' data output was less a diagnostic tool and more a random number generator, but patients, trusting the brand and the name Elizabeth Holmes, made life-altering decisions based on its hollow promises. Within this dangerous maelstrom, the first internal fractures appeared. In 2014, Tyler Shultz, George Shultz's own grandson, realized the full, terrifying scope of the fraud. His attempts to raise alarms internally were met with Balwani's customary abuse and Holmes's icy denial. Shultz and his colleague Erica Chung, unable to bear the ethical burden, secretly began collecting evidence, knowing that exposing the truth would likely mean the end of their careers, intense legal retaliation, and for Tyler, a painful schism within his family. Soon after, a medical expert, troubled by Theranos' secretive technology and lack of peer review, made a phone call that changed everything. The call went to the investigative reporter known for his persistence and skeptical eye for Silicon Valley hubris. His name was John Carreyrou, and he worked for the Wall Street Journal. The stage was set for a dramatic, winner-take-all confrontation between the power of a $9 billion illusion and the persistence of the truth. The call to John Carreyrou of the Wall Street Journal ignited the true investigative thriller. In early 2015, Carreyrou began his covert, months-long quest for the truth, even as medical skepticism, led by Stanford's John Ioannidis, grew louder in professional journals. Holmes's only response was to dismiss the criticism as ignorance of her proprietary process and trade secrets. Carreyrou patiently sought out those who had worked behind the curtain, finding his crucial witnesses in the idealistic but disillusioned former employees, Tyler Shultz and Erica Chung. These young whistleblowers, facing the immense legal and financial might of Theranos, provided the internal documents and first-hand accounts that confirmed the company's deceit. The Edison's failure, the substitution with commercial machines, and the catastrophic data dilution. When Elizabeth Holmes became aware of the investigation, she unleashed the full force of her legal power. She hired David Boies, one of America's most high-profile and expensive litigators, famous for both corporate and high-stakes political cases. The pursuit of the whistleblowers became relentless. Boies' firm executed an aggressive, strong-arm strategy, legal threats, surveillance, and explicit warnings of financial ruin. Tyler Shultz endured a personal and professional hell. His grandfather, George Shultz, initially sided completely with Holmes, his friend and protege, effectively turning his back on his own grandson. Tyler was subjected to threats of ruinous lawsuits and surveillance, creating a family civil war that perfectly symbolized the drama of the entire saga. The old, established world blinded by the young, compelling fraud, fighting the painful truth brought by the younger generation. But Carreyrou refused to be intimidated, and his sources, now fully committed, refused to break. The explosion occurred in October 2015. Despite immense legal pressure and threats against himself and his sources, the Wall Street Journal published the bombshell exposé. The article detailed how the Edison device was fundamentally flawed and that Theranos was secretly running the majority of its tests on modified third-party machines. Holmes's reaction was not one of panic, but of defiance. She immediately went on CNBC's Mad Money with Jim Cramer, her deep voice steady and resolute. She dismissed the report as the work of a tabloid and promised the immediate publication of data that would silence her critics. It was here she delivered the line that encapsulated her delusion. This is what happens when you work to change things. First, they think you're crazy, then they fight you, and then all of a sudden, you change the world. She was denying a reality that was, by then, undeniable. The article was the fatal crack that allowed the regulatory sunlight to stream in. The dominoes began to fall with startling speed. The Food and Drug Administration, followed by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, launched full-scale inspections. The CMS investigation of the Newark, California lab delivered the most damning indictment. The facility posed an immediate jeopardy to patient health and safety due to critical flaws in its coagulation testing procedures. The corporate facade could no longer hold. By early 2016, Walgreens had suspended services, and by June, it had formally terminated its partnership, closing all remaining Theranos centers. The company was forced to retract or correct all test results generated by its proprietary Edison devices over a 2-year period, affecting hundreds of thousands of patients. In the summer of 2016, the hammer fell. The CMS revoked the company's Clinical Laboratory Improvement Amendment Certificate, effectively banning Theranos from the blood testing business. Furthermore, it levied sanctions that prohibited Holmes and Balwani from owning or operating a certified clinical laboratory for 2 years. The collapse was quantifiable. Forbes, in a startling revision, reduced Elizabeth Holmes's personal net worth from $4.5 billion to zero. The company's valuation dropped to negligible levels. The empire was collapsing, but the fight was far from over. In 2017, Theranos settled with the state of Arizona, agreeing to a $4.65 million refund to every resident who had paid for one of their tests. But the civil penalty was soon followed by criminal pursuit. Following years of investigation, the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission formally charged Holmes and Balwani with massive fraud in March 2018. Holmes quickly settled the SEC charges, paying a $500,000 fine and agreeing to a decade-long ban from holding officer or director positions in any public company. This was an attempt to buy her way out of trouble, but the Department of Justice was not interested in a civil settlement. On June 15, 2018, a federal grand jury indicted Elizabeth Holmes and Sunny Balwani on 9 counts of wire fraud and 2 counts of conspiracy to commit wire fraud. The core of the charge was a multi-million-dollar scheme to defraud investors and a separate scheme to defraud doctors and patients. Holmes resigned as CEO, and in September 2018, the company formally announced its dissolution and liquidation. The flawless image was shattered. The self-made billionaire now stood not on the cover of a magazine, but on the precipice of a federal courtroom, facing the most serious charges of her life. The fall of the empire gave way to the drama of the court. When Theranos was officially dissolved in September 2018, its remaining assets were liquidated, making the vast sums poured into the company by investors, a staggering total exceeding $700 million, effectively worthless. The stage was now set for the criminal trial. In preparation for the inevitable legal battle, Elizabeth Holmes made 2 significant, highly calculated moves. First, she broke contact with Sunny Balwani, who had left the company in 2016. Second, she entirely remade her personal life, marrying William "Billy" Evans, the heir to a California hotel chain, in a private ceremony in 2019. The trial, U.S. vs. Elizabeth A. Holmes, began in the summer of 2021 after being delayed by the COVID-19 pandemic and, notably, the birth of her first child. Holmes's defense was a carefully constructed narrative based on two key arguments. The first was the classic Silicon Valley defense. She was a pure visionary who was simply too young and too focused on the big picture to have committed intentional, granular fraud. She claimed she relied in good faith on her technical staff. The second and more gripping line of defense was the Svengali defense, arguing that Balwani, 19 years her senior, had subjected her to a decade of emotional, psychological, and sexual abuse, controlling her life and all her decisions at Theranos. The courtroom heard months of testimony detailing faked demonstrations for investors, the use of competitor machines, and fraudulent claims about the company's financial status, including a fabricated $100 million revenue figure when the true amount was closer to a paltry $100,000. Ultimately, while the jury heard her claims of abuse, the defense failed to fully absolve her, as Holmes herself admitted under oath that Balwani did not force her to make the specific, fraudulent statements to investors and partners. On January 3, 2022, the jury delivered a complex verdict. Elizabeth Holmes was found guilty on 4 counts, 3 counts of wire fraud and 1 count of conspiracy, all relating to the defrauding of investors. Significantly, she was found not guilty on 4 counts related to the defrauding of patients, and the jury was deadlocked on the remaining counts. This outcome represented a strange irony. Legally, the jury found her guilty of stealing the money, but not necessarily of risking the lives. On November 18, 2022, Judge Edward Davila sentenced Elizabeth Holmes to 11 years and 3 months in federal prison. Balwani, convicted separately on all 12 counts against him, received a sentence of nearly 13 years. They were jointly ordered to pay over $452 million in restitution to the victims of the fraud. The timing of her life events, marrying a wealthy heir, having 2 children, her second child was conceived and born after her indictment, a fact her legal team attempted to use to delay her sentence, drew intense scrutiny and speculation that she was consciously trying to garner sympathy. Nevertheless, on May 30, 2023, after all appeals were exhausted, Elizabeth Holmes surrendered to authorities and began serving her sentence at the federal prison camp in Bryan, Texas. The spectacular rise and fall of Elizabeth Holmes is now etched into the cautionary lore of Silicon Valley. Her story, featuring an unprecedented cast of characters and a near-perfect execution of a decade-long con, has had consequences beyond her own imprisonment, creating an unfortunate stigma for other female entrepreneurs in the tech and science sectors. Perhaps the final, ultimate irony of her meticulously crafted image was revealed in 2023. In an interview conducted just before she went to prison, Holmes spoke in her natural, higher-pitched voice, confirming what many former employees suspected. The famous deep baritone was yet another layer of the fraud, a calculated affectation designed to project authority and seriousness. Elizabeth Holmes, the woman who sought to revolutionize medicine with a single drop of blood, ultimately left behind a poisonous legacy. She is the definitive case study of the perilous line between the cult of the visionary and outright criminality. Confined now to a minimum security prison, the former billionaire, still planning her eventual return, remains a chilling testament to the dangers of ambition untethered from ethics.